Welcome to tonight's Philosophy Matters session. My name is Akiva. I help moderate and coordinate the group along with Allan, who is our speaker tonight. Philosophy Matters is a Humanists Australia community, so it's just to introduce both the topic and the speaker. Perhaps we'll start with the speaker first, so you know a little bit of background on Les. And then I will just go through Les's topic, which she'll obviously then expand on. Leslie Adam trained academically in philosophy and history of religions at La Trobe University. In his working life, Leslie's career spanned electronics, information technology, training and development, and business improvement. Over the years, he has authored many articles and given various talks on humanism, ethics, religion, and philosophy. In 2018, Leslie started up Australia's first ex-religious support network. Leslie has served twice as Vice President for Humanists Victoria and currently sits on the board of Humanists Australia. Les also runs the Philosophy Matters meetup and is owner of rationalrealm.com, a website dedicated to exploring the boundaries between science and philosophy. So, on to Sam Harris and free will. Sam Harris's little book on free will was published in 2012, gaining a receptive response from scientifically minded followers. In this first part of a two-part series, Leslie Allan will put Harris's two key arguments against the human capacity for free will under the microscope. Harris's first point is that we could not have behaved differently than we in fact did. His second point appeals to his introspecting that we are not the conscious source of our choices and actions. You are here to find out whether his arguments stack up. And there are online versions of Leslie's full critique and also a shorter book review, which are worth reading along with tonight's presentation. So over to you, Leslie.
Thanks very much for the intro, Akiva. Okay, so where you can get the full extended analysis of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is in the philosophy section of my Rational Realm website. So the full essay, the full long essay is titled Sam Harris, Free Will and Moral Responsibility. You can download it as a PDF. And as Akiva mentioned, there's a short, much shorter version, the book review, Free Will by Sam Harris. You can get that and download it as a PDF as well in the reviews section. And then if you're interested in how a determinist should look at praise and blame, punishing, relationships with other people, if you see them as basically as mechanical robots subject to the law of cause and effect, how ought we view our friends, our family, our workmates, then I've got a little piece called Determinism, Morality and Human Relationships, and that's in the reflections section. Now, what I do want to cover tonight is this. So who firstly is Sam Harris, for those who haven't heard of him? And what's his book about? What is Sam Harris's own objectives in writing his little book, Free Will? And then I'll review both of Sam Harris's arguments against free will. His first argument that we couldn't have behaved differently than what we in fact do. And the second of his arguments against free will is he says, we are not the source. We are not the conscious source of our own thoughts. And in that, this is the key piece. I'll be bringing out what I think are two conflicting theories of mind, two views of how we act in the world and the nature of mind that Harris holds, view one and view two. And how they really are two conflicting theories and really muddle his two arguments. And then towards the end of that, I'll show how those conflicts in his views of what the mind is and how it operates, it generates three paradoxes. So I'll talk about the three paradoxes, and then I'll sum up with what then do we think of Harris's two arguments against free will. Did he succeed or not? So who's Sam Harris? He was born in 1967 in California. He's got a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy in the year 2000. He's got a PhD in Cognitive Neuroscience in 2009. He's regarded as a vanguard of what's called New Atheism's pushback against fundamentalist religion. And in that regard, he's regarded as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, these four horsemen who attack religion, along with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Unfortunately, the two of the four horsemen have now died. Christopher Hitchens died a few years ago, and Professor Daniel Dennett died just unfortunately a little earlier this year. Now, Sam Harris is also a big advocate for meditation and mindfulness. And this really shows out in his first key argument, his second key argument against free will. It plays a big part. Now, in this analysis, I'm a really big critic of Sam Harris's arguments, but like all of us, we are a mix of good and bad. That doesn't mean I think Sam Harris is all bad or he's silly. He does a lot of good work, and he's done a lot of good work in pushing back against fundamental religion. The first thing I've got a note there, he also pledges regularly 10% of his income to effective charities. He's got a very popular podcast called Waking Up, and his two other best-known books are The End of Faith, which from memory is a critique of Christianity, and the other one is The Moral Landscape, trying to put morality on a naturalist plane, taking a naturalist view of what morality is about. Now, the book we're talking about tonight, Free Will, published in 2012, so it's already, 12 years old. It's a very short book, only 75 pages. The core of it is around about less than 50 pages, so it's a pretty quick read. Now, how many people here have read Sam Harris's book? I can't see all your hands, so one. Okay, maybe one. All right, then it might be a good thing if I just give a quick rundown of what's in the book. So the first chapter, The Unconscious Origins of the Will, here Sam Harris draws on his own introspection and the very famous Libet experiments to show that we're not conscious authors of our actions, as our brains have already decided for us what we are going to do. The next chapter, Changing the Subject. Here, Harris defends his view against compatibilists. Now, compatibilists are people like me who think that free will is entirely compatible with determinism. So he defends his view against the compatibilists who describe a kind of free will that Sam Harris thinks is irrelevant to the way most people use the term free will. His next chapter, Cause and Effect. There he argues the indeterminists, people who think that determinism is not true. He argues against them relying on possible quantum indeterminacy to make, and Sam Harris thinks that makes free will and moral responsibility for our actions inexplicable or unexplainable. His next chapter, Choices, Efforts, Intentions. This is the interesting chapter where Sam Harris makes a radical U-turn by resurrecting common sense notions that our choices really do matter and that we bear moral and legal responsibility for our actions. The next little chapter, Might the Truth Be Bad for Us? There, Sam concedes that accepting determinism does lead to bad consequences for some people, but for him, it's made him a better person with more control over his life. The next chapter, Moral Responsibility, is really one of the key chapters in his books. In his book, here he tries to resurrect the common sense notions of right and wrong and moral responsibility by working through 5 case studies of unintentional and the intentional killing of a young innocent woman. The little chapter on politics, there he tries to show that even though the notion of the self-made man is a fiction, we still need to hold people to account in spite of them neither choosing their genes nor their circumstances. And then in his conclusion, he uses, using an experiment on himself, he reinforces how we are completely unaware of the cause of our ideas, and thus for him, the free will concept is nonsensical. So that's a brief rundown of the book. So the key definitions that I'll be using that you may not be familiar with, that are the key terminology in this debate. Determinism, it's the view that all human actions, and that's both voluntary and involuntary, have a complete cause in terms of physical states of the brain and its processes. So this is physical determinism, that all of your actions are completely caused by events in the brain. There are other versions. There's what's called psychological determinism and theological determinism. And we'll have a mention of psychological determinism a little later. Indeterminism is the opposite view. It's a view that that says that some human behaviours, at least some human behaviours, are not fully caused by prior physical brain states or anything else. Libertarianism, the next word, is a kind of indeterminism. It's the view that that determinism is false on the one hand, and that human beings do have the capacity for free will on the other. So yes, determinism, no to determinism, yes to free will. Hard determinism is the opposite view. Hard determinism is the view that determinism is true, and because of that, we don't have the capacity for free will. And then compatibilism, it says, pox on both your houses. Determinism is compatible. Determinism is compatible with our capacity for free will, and that's the camp I am in. Now, the term free will, the last word here in our definitions, that's the hotly contested item. What does free will means? But both sides, all sides of the debate, generally agree that it refers to genuine human agency and to the ability to have done otherwise under the same circumstances. So I hope that makes it a little bit clearer. Okay, some people find this diagram that I made up a number of years ago helpful, the 4 quadrants. So if you think that determinism is false, no to determinism, but you think that and we also don't have free will, then you're in the top left quadrant, hard determinism. If you think that determinism is true, and yet we do have free will, then you're in the top right quadrant, compatibilism. It used to be called soft determinism. That term has fallen out of favor, and that's really good because a lot of people new to the area thought that soft determinism was soft on determinism. It was a weak form of determinism. That's not the case. Soft determinists, the compatibilists, are just as determinist as the hard determinists. We just disagree on whether we have free will or not. And then if you think that determinism is false, and for that reason, or largely for that reason, that's why we have free will, then you're in the bottom right quadrant, the libertarian. Okay, so Harris has got 2 main objectives for writing his little book on free will. The first one is to demolish the notion that human beings have true agency, that is, that they can exercise their free will. And his argument is based on 2 things. One, Harris's own introspection of his own mental states, looking inwards, and 2, what he thinks is the scientific truth that all human actions have a physical cause, namely states of the brain. That's his first key objective. The second key objective is He wants to show how this seemingly alarming conclusion about human agency, that we don't have any, it need not diminish our sense of moral responsibility. He thinks we still are morally responsible. Now, I'm going to address that question and that argument of his in the second of my 2 talks in this series. With his argument against free will, he's got 2 key things he wants to say. He wants to attack what he thinks are 2 key false assumptions upon which the free willers believe in free will. And the first false assumption he wants to tear down is this one, that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past. So when I chose coffee this morning, it really was a live option for me to have chosen tea instead. And Sam Harris thinks, no, Les, you're wrong about that. The second false assumption he wants to attack is this one, our idea that we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions in the present. He's saying, no, your conscious thoughts don't have any causal role to play. When you picked up the cup of coffee this morning, your conscious thoughts, your intentions had nothing to do in that causal story. It's all down to your brain. It was your brain that made you pick up the cup of coffee. Okay, so these are the 2 key false assumptions that Harris wants to bring down in his little book. So I'm going to deal with each of these in turn. We're going to deal with the first one first. So could we have behaved differently? So for Harris, having free will means not being restricted by the laws of physics. And he illustrates this with a case of rapists and murderers on page 17. So all page references here, unless stated otherwise, to the Kindle version, of his book, Free Will. He says, to say that they, rapists and murderers, were free not to rape and murder is to say that they could have resisted the impulse to do so, or could have avoided feeling such an impulse altogether. With the universe, including their brains, in precisely the same state it was in at the moment they committed their crimes. So for Harris, having free will entails replaying the tape and sometimes getting a different outcome. So replaying the tape, that goes back to our video cassette recorder days where we hit rewind back to the time just before this morning when Les was going to choose tea or coffee. Let's rewind the tape. And Sam is saying to have free will, we've got to rewind the cosmic clock or rewind the tape to just before Les chose tea or coffee this morning. And when we rewind it, then press play, some of those times when we press play, Les is going to choose tea instead of coffee. So that's what Sam's saying, that's what free will means. Okay, but is that really the case? There's an alternative view. It's an alternative compatibilist view. And the compatibilists like me point out that there are 2 senses of could have done otherwise. So I could have chosen tea this morning instead of coffee. And Sam, so the 2 senses are the unconditional sense, which Sam is talking about, and then there's a second conditional sense. Now, the unconditional sense that Sam is talking about, I'll put it like this, semi-technical language, that to say that X could have done otherwise is to say that X's alternative action is somewhat immune from the laws of physics, initial conditions, and causal necessity. So given the laws of physics, given the initial conditions that were there at the time just before Les chose tea or coffee, it couldn't have, it's, to put it a bit technically, you can logically entails that Les chose coffee, not would have chosen coffee, that Les chose coffee. So There's no causal slackness there. It's completely determined by this causal necessity. Now, the second sense, which I think is the more usual sense when we talk about could have and could not have done otherwise in normal discourse, this conditional sense, I put it as when we say X could have done otherwise, it means X's alternative action is deducible from the laws of physics, X's capabilities, and different conditions. Now, what does that mean? It means that sure, we agree, that the laws of physics are completely deterministic, but what we're talking about is the capabilities or the capacities of a thing, and we're just varying the conditions that were in play at the time X chose, and looking at different conditions in different scenarios, Les would have chosen differently. So what I'm saying is that in saying X could have freely chosen otherwise, we're using this second conditional sense of could have. Now, I know this is might seem like a bit of technical mumbo jumbo, so I really want to bring this out in a practical, everyday case to illustrate what I mean. So here's an example of something that's completely dictated by the laws of physics. So the way motor cars operate, they don't have a soul. Quantum indeterminacy doesn't have any role to play in how the car goes down the track. It's a completely deterministic entity. But here's a case where Andrew Frankel, he's a sports writer, and he was writing about this production sports race, the Nürburgring, and he's writing about the Mercedes AMG 1 hypercar breaking the production car record at that race. And he says, not least because the car could have gone faster still. Not least because the car could have gone faster still. Okay, so what does he mean by that? So one thing he did not mean is that if the race organisers were able to repeatedly wind the clock back precisely to the point in time at which the race started, with some of these windbacks, the car could have broken the laws of physics to go faster than it did. I mean, to think that Andrew, the sports writer, was meaning that, I mean, that's just nonsense. So what did he mean? Andrew Frankel did mean that the car had the capability to go faster than it actually did. That if the external conditions had been different, it would have gone faster. Now, Andrew Frankel said exactly what those conditions were, that if they had been, the car would have gone faster. He says, the time was set at the end of October in far from optimal conditions for such an exercise. The track temperature was lower than the tyres would have liked, one, and two, the surface was both damp and dirty in certain key places. So this is what we mean in this second conditional sense, that given the capabilities of the thing you're talking about, how it could have behaved differently if there were different circumstances operating at the time. In this case, higher track temperature and no dirt or dampness on the track. Now, look, you may think, yeah, Andrew Frankel, he's using a unusual sense of could have. That's not the way we normally talk. But this is the way we normally talk about could have and couldn't have. You could get on the internet and look up could have gone faster, car could have gone faster. You'll see lots of examples. I mean, here's another one from Jake Williams-Smith. He says the car could have gone faster on jet power alone. I mean, Bertel Schmidt said in a piece he wrote, the car could have gone faster, but it would have gone airborne in the turn. So this is a normal way of speaking. Now, in my essay called Free Will and Compatibilism, which is referenced down the bottom of the screen there, I give some other examples of where we speak of things could have happened differently to these deterministic objects. Like the first case there, Hurricane Katrina, a journalist wrote, Hurricane Katrina could have killed more people. than the Galveston hurricane did. And she's saying that if Hurricane Katrina had come into where the land was at an earlier time, there would have been more people in that town at that time. Second example, this was a headline in an article, news item, falling branch could have killed more. Well, the journalist wasn't talking about the branch breaking the laws of physics. She was talking about how in that storm, given the size and the weight of the branch, if there were people walking under the tree at that time, when the branch fell, they could have been killed. And there's another example there, which I won't go into. Hopefully that illustrates what I'm talking about with this second usual conditional sense of could have and couldn't have. So applying that conditional sense of could have done otherwise, let's apply that now to Harris' example of the rapists and murderers. So taking on board that more usual conditional sense, to say that some rapists and murderers could have resisted the impulse to rape and murder is to say that they were capable of not raping and murdering. That is, that they had the capacity to weigh their options, regulate their emotions, plan with foresight, understand the consequences of their actions, and so on. And the second key point here is that, as with the racing car that we're talking about, absent a serious mechanical malfunction, a criminal likewise could have done otherwise if they were not suffering some cognitive, conative, or affective malfunction, such as a brain tumor, mental illness, addiction, brainwashing, and so on. Now, this is written about and spoken about this by compatibilist authors, and this is exactly what I discuss. These conditions that put us in a state where we can't act freely, like when there's a racing car that's had a serious malfunction, it can no longer race at all. And I talk a lot about that in my paper on free will and compatibilism. But that's the basic gist of how a compatibilist, how a compatibilist part of their argument in showing that free will is compatible with determinism that Harris doesn't really engage with in his book. And talking about not engaging, so what does Sam Harris say about this compatibilist analysis of could have done otherwise? Well, he says, he's quite dismissive. He says compatibilists have produced a vast literature in an effort to finesse this problem, the problem of free will, more than in any other area of academic philosophy. The result resembles theology. The problem is he also later takes a backflip on his thinking that that things could not have been otherwise. So on page 33, he says something really interesting. He says, we are free to interpret and to reinterpret the meaning of our lives. We can pursue any line of thought we want. And then on page 42, he says, our system of justice should reflect an understanding that any of us could have been dealt a very different hand in life. So there he's accepting that things could have been different, even though the universe is deterministic, and that we are free to interpret and reinterpret, and we can do something other than we did. So he said, well, not seems to be going back on what he was saying. Quite expressly, he's going back on what he's saying. And then he makes this huge concession to Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett, after Sam's book was published, Daniel wrote a critical piece on it. And then Sam Harris responded to Daniel Dennett. And interesting, in that response to Daniel Dennett, he says, yes, there are two readings of could, and Daniel's talking about the conditional and the unconditional sense. Yes, there are two readings of could, and you find only one of them interesting. So I think that's a really big and important concession that Daniel Dennett makes. Okay, so progress so far. Harris argues against two supposed key false assumptions supporting free will. We've just looked at the first of them, that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past. Sam Harris says no. Problem here is Sam ignores this conditional sense of could have done otherwise. So I've ticked that one off. We've dealt with that objection of Sam's. So we're now going to go on to the second objection of Sam's. He's going to object where we think that we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions in the present. He's got two arguments here, the argument from introspection and the argument from neuroscience. So I'm going to have a look at each one of those. The argument from introspection, he says on page 10, seeming acts of volition merely arise spontaneously, whether caused, uncaused, or probabilistically inclined, it makes no difference, and cannot be traced to a point of origin in our conscious minds. A moment or two of serious self-scrutiny, and you might observe that you no more decide the next thought you think than the next thought I write. And then on page 14, he says, but where intentions themselves come from and what determines their character in every instance remains perfectly mysterious in subjective terms. We do not know what we intend to do until the intention itself arises. I think Sam is wrong there, and here's some counterexamples. I think a little reflection shows that we can decide our next thought and intention. And here's some really basic, day-to-day living examples. I can decide that my next thought will be about the first house I bought. I can resolve that tomorrow I'll work on an overdue project. Now, when I go to the dentist and I hate having my teeth cleaned, it's so uncomfortable. And during that time, I distract myself. I distract myself with thoughts of going to my favorite concert is one of them. And I think about the pleasures of being on the concert while I'm having my gums and teeth attacked. So to relieve my discomfort in the dentist chair, I distract myself with thoughts of my favorite artist. So I can, there's another example where I can preemptively choose what I'm going to think. So the second problem is that on reflection shows that we can know the source of some of our intentions. So for example, I know my intention to eat my lunch came from my feeling of hunger. There's no mystery there. And lastly, reflection shows that we can know what we intend to do before the intention arises. Like for example, I know when I awake tomorrow morning, I will intend to get out of bed. So I know my intention a long time before I actually have the intention. So really basic, simple examples. And this, well, I'll talk about more about this later, but where Sam is coming from is from his work in meditation and mindfulness, where you just sit and observe your thoughts, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so that was Harris's first argument from introspection. Now, his second argument from neuroscience. So he mentions the very famous Libet experiments from the 1980s. And for those who are not familiar with the Libet experiments, because Sam does, well, he explains it a little bit. I'm not going to, the quote I have there doesn't explain it. So just let me give you this summary from a Journal of Neuroscience paper. And if you want the reference to this, I can give it. So in that paper, the author says, in the early 1980s, the neurologist Benjamin Libet performed landmark experiments aimed at investigating the role of consciousness in the generation of a motor action coming from the motor cortex, moving your arms and moving your limbs. So Libet in 1983 measured the time when subjects became consciously aware of the decision to move. In the first experiments, it was moving a finger. Using a clock with a rapidly rotating dot, the subjects were asked to note the position of the moving dot when she was aware of the conscious decision to move a finger. Scalp EEG, electroencephalogram, was used simultaneously to monitor brain activity during the experiment. Libet found a pre-movement buildup of electrical potential called readiness potential. So what they found was in this part of the brain, some hundreds of milliseconds beforehand, they saw a rise in the potential, electric potential, many hundreds of milliseconds before the patient said that they were now forming the intention to move their finger. So with that context, this is what Harris says about some later experiments. There's a whole range of experiments coming from that on page 12. More recently, direct recordings from the cortex showed that the activity of merely 256 neurons was sufficient to predict with 80% accuracy a person's decision to move 700 milliseconds before he became aware of it. Some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave however you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. End of quote. So the first problem here is that this 80% accuracy of prediction is not proof of determinism. It still leaves plenty of, that 20% is plenty of wriggle room for the indeterminists to say, well, look, it's not complete. Determinism is 100% predictive accuracy. You've only got 80%. Plenty of room for indeterminist forces, either from souls or quantum indeterminacy. So another thing is, which I haven't really spent time here, is the implications of the Libet experiments and the many experiments after that is still very much hotly debated about what it means in terms of the relationship between neuronal events and human volition, human decision making. There's still a huge amount of debate about it. Now, for a more competent treatment, I do direct you to Robert Sapolsky's recent book called Determinism. Now, he's a determinist like Sam Harris and like me, but he has a whole chapter devoted to these complexities and nuances in interpreting these kinds of results. Now, I'm not saying determinism is false. Determinism is true. But what I am saying is these kinds of experiments to show that we don't have free will are highly, highly, highly contentious. Now, this is the second major point that I've got. These deal with rapid decisions, reflex type decisions made in the moment. These are very, very different cognitive processes that we use compared with when we are making what we call, longer term freely made decisions, like, for example, choosing which school to send your daughter to or which house you're going to buy. These are decisions using a lot of cognitive apparatus in our brain, different regions in our brain, over an extended period of time. So these kinds of experiments have got literally nothing to say about these other freely willed volitions that we are talking about. Okay, so continuing on with this second argument from neuroscience of Sam Harris's, here's something else he says in his argument. The fact that someone else could report what you were about to think and do would expose this feeling of free will for what it is, an illusion. Actually, I do a whole talk on the supposed illusion of free will. And even if determinism is true, I argue that there is no illusion of free will. Anyway, continuing on with what Sam Harris says, if the laws of nature do not strike most of us as incompatible with free will, that is because we have not imagined how human behavior would appear if all cause and effect relationships were understood. Now, my first point here is that there have been many people who have put a lot of thought into this. Sam says, we have not imagined how human behavior would appear. Well, a lot of us have imagined it. And in fact, nearly 60% of professional philosophers who have looked at this question of free will and determinism, nearly 60% disagree with Sam. They think that free will is completely compatible with determinism. Only 11.2% of professional philosophers agree with Harris. And I've got the reference there to the latest worldwide sample survey of professional philosophers. The second point I want to make is that, and this is really a key point, Harris assumes without argument or doing any kind of analysis of the way ordinary people use free will talk, he just assumes that the word free in the term free will means wholly or partly uncaused. Now, I say a lot more about this in my piece on free will and determinism, but I just want to give you the crux of it. There's a lot of phrases in English where free is the first word in this phrase. There's free thought, free market, free range chicken, free hand drawing, free evening. But let's take the one in the top right, free fall. What does that mean? When we say that this guy is in free fall, we're not saying that if we wound back the clock to when just before he jumped out of the aeroplane, that his fall sometimes would have been different. We're not saying that when he's free falling, he's somehow breaking the laws of physics. What we're saying is that in free fall, his fall is not constrained. His fall is not constrained by anything, ropes, wires, or anything. Look, take free range chicken. I mean, that's another common term. So chickens moving in a free way, ranging freely outside. We're not saying that when the chickens are free ranging, that they're somehow once again breaking the laws of physics in the way they're ranging around in the yard. What we're saying is that their movements are not constrained by being in a factory farm barn. Their movements are not constrained by being in something like a factory farmed barn. That's what we mean. And look at the other ones. You can take any of those, and you can see that the word free there is meaning unconstrained and not breaking the laws of physics or rewinding the tape back. So my key point at the bottom there, in none of these phrases does free signify uncaused or undetermined or underdetermined, like the hard determinists say, like Sam Harris. So how so for the word free will? And this is where I think Sam Harris needs to explain himself. Why is it the term free doesn't have that connotation in all of these other uses, but somehow it does for the term free will? What I want to conclude here is that both Harris's argument from introspection and his argument from neuroscience, they both intend to show how we are puppets. This isn't going to the conclusion. This is going to my next point, sorry. How they're both intended to show how we are puppets dancing to the tune of unconscious brain processes beyond our control. So here's some important quotes from Sam, where he says, we have no genuine agency. On page 21, the choice was made for me by events in my brain. On the same page, people feel or presume an authorship of their thoughts and actions that is illusory. And on page 22, there is no question that our attribution of agency can be gravely in error. I am arguing that it always is. So we are not agents of our own thoughts and we are not agents of our own actions. He makes that very, very clear. So I call this Harris's helpless puppet view of the mind. And this is what he relies on to disprove free will. Because if we are not the agents of our own thoughts and not the agents of our actions, then for him, obviously, they're not freely made. So I call this a helpless puppet view. The thing is, he advances a contrasting view when he later on goes to defend the distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions. And when he goes on to defend how, in spite of determinism, we still are morally responsible for our actions. So he goes on to develop a contrasting view. So this first view I've got over there on the left, I call it the Harris version 1 helpless puppet view, which he uses to argue that we have no free will. But later on, he goes to develop this version 2, what I call the rational agent view, which he needs to show how we are morally responsible for our actions. So I want to delve into both of those views now. So the version 1 helpless puppet view, it's very much like or the same as what's called an epiphenomenalist theory of mind. Now I've got there a little info box down there in the bottom right-hand corner, says what epiphenomenalism is. It's a theory of mind that posits that mental events have no causal powers, that mental events are simply inert byproducts of physical brain processes. So have a look at the diagram that I've got there. That circle is a picture of neurons, and these neuronal events cause the intention. I've got picture there, the intention to rob this little old lady. So the brain events cause the mental event, the intention, and also the brain events cause, because they end up, the electrical firings end up in the motor cortex to move the guy's arms and hands and feet. The neuronal events go on to cause the robbing of the woman. Now, why is this important? Because for Harris, at the start, Harris talks about the intentional crimes committed by criminals. And he suggests these neurophysiological processes are more, that we have these neurophysiological processes that cause our intentions and cause our bodily movements, that these are morally exculpatory. That means that these neuronal events make it so that we're not morally responsible for our actions at all, as it was these physical events in our brains that gave rise to our thoughts and actions. And hey, you can't blame me for the intentions that I have, because like Harris says right at the start of his book with the case of drinking coffee that morning, he says, it wasn't me choosing coffee, my brain made me do it. He says it quite explicitly. So this is this first view, and just to illustrate with some of the quotes from the book to bring this out. On page 9, he says, thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. On the next page, he says, seeming acts of volition merely arise spontaneously and cannot be traced to a point of origin in our conscious minds. And then on page 11, he says, this is the case I was talking about. Did I consciously choose tea over coffee? No, the choice was made for me by events in my brain that I, as the conscious witness of my thoughts and actions, could not inspect or influence. And then on page 14, but where intentions themselves come from and what determines their character in every instance remains perfectly mysterious in subjective terms. And then back to page 11, the intention to do one thing and not another does not originate in consciousness. Rather, it appears in consciousness as does any thought or impulse that might oppose it. And on the next page, what will my next mental state be? I do not know. It just happens. And on page 19, my mental life is simply given to me by the cosmos. So I think all of these quotes build up this image of us as helpless puppets. So that's the version 1, helpless puppet view. And then contrast that with a view he brings in later when he wants to rescue moral responsibility. As I said, I call this the Harris version 2, the rational agent view of mind. And whereas the previous view was an epiphenomenalist view of mind, this view is more akin to what's called what's called the identity theory of mind. And I've got a little yellow info box there that outlines what the identity theory of mind is. It's a theory of mind positing mental events are literally identical to physical brain events. And a good example used in the literature is how water is identical to H2O, or dihydrogen oxide. They're the same thing, water, H2O. And as such, because mental events are now identical with physical brain events, they now have causal powers. Our intentions can actually do stuff in the world. So on version 1, the helpless puppet view, thoughts and intentions are caused by unknown brain events and not other mental events. But now on this version 2, rational agent view, thoughts and intentions are physical events. So looking at the diagram, looking at the middle part, before where we had the neuronal events causing the thought bubble, the intention, now I've got them in, what is it? It's not a parallelogram, hexagram or whatever. I've got them both encased, meaning they are the same thing. The intention to rob the little old lady is exactly the same thing as one of these neuronal states in our brain. And then both of those together, it's not now just the neuronal events that cause the robbing of the lady. It's both together, the neuronal event and the mental event together. They're the same thing. Both those now cause the robbing of the lady. So now our intentions have causal power. Okay, so we're looking at version 1 and version 2. And I was talking about version 2, the rational agent view that he's bringing in to rescue the notion of moral responsibility. Now I've got a quote down. Oh, so this is a quote that really brings out very clearly his now version 2 rational agent view. He says, my choice to write it, his book Free Will, was unquestionably the primary cause of its coming into being. Decisions, intentions, efforts, goals, willpower, etc., are causal states of the brain, leading to specific behaviors, and behaviors lead to outcomes in the world. Okay, so to contrast these two views, I've got them on sitting side by side. So Harris's version 1 helpless puppet view, he's giving the picture here of what we do when we're meditating. We're not engaging with the world. We're not acting in the world. We're just noticing stuff, like noticing a nose itch, and then you notice that you're thinking about your childhood friend, and you notice a gust of wind outside, and then you notice you're thinking about or singing your favorite tune. You're not doing anything about them. You are just a passive observer. And this is the view he needs to show that we have no free will. We have no agency. The universe is just coming down on us, and like the puppet strings that he's got on the cover of his book, we are just dancing to the puppet strings. We have no real agency. So illustrated by these two quotes, what will my next mental state be? I do not know. It just happens. And next one, my mental life is simply given to me by the cosmos. Okay, so contrasting that with his version 2 rational agent view. So here, we're actively engaging in the world, and this is what he needs to show that we really are morally responsible. It's us doing stuff. It's us interacting with the world. So he tells this lovely little story to bring out this rational agent view of feeling the pain in his back. I might unconsciously shift in my seat, but I cannot unconsciously decide that the pain in my back warrants a trip to a physical therapist. To do the latter, I must become aware of the pain and be consciously motivated to do something about it. And there I've drawn a little flow diagram of what Sam Harris is illustrating here. And here's some reflective mechanisms. There's mechanisms that are that have got goals. There are discrimination mechanisms. Is it more or less, yes or no? And then acting on the basis of the if-then statement. So it's a flow. It's an activity. And the big contrast is this picture of the mind, that it's engaged with the world and engaged with other internal processes, compared with the version 1 view, which we are just passive observers of what the universe just happens to pump into my mind at that given moment. Well, the big question here is, are we the source of our thoughts? And he's been arguing that we're not the source of all of our thoughts. But a key point I've got here is that Harris explicitly walks back his version 1 helpless puppet view by assuming that imagining, and when we imagine something, imagining is a kind of thought, but Harris assumes that imagining causes other thoughts. And here's one example on page 13. He says, if the laws of nature do not strike most of us as incompatible with free will, that is because we have not imagined how human behavior would appear if all cause and effect relationships were understood. And here's another example on page 25. Imagine what your life would be like if all your actions, intentions, beliefs, and desires were randomly self-generated in this way. You would scarcely seem to have a mind at all. So my key point here is, if Harris didn't think the mental state of imagining would bring about a new belief, a new mental state, then why ask the reader to engage in his proposed imagining? So our mental lives are more efficacious, can cause other mental events, which is completely different to the version 1 helpless puppet view that he propounds in the earlier part of his book. Now, Harris does some more walking back from his version 1 helpless puppet view. He says on page 10, seeming acts of volition. So this is his his version 1 helpless puppet view. Seeming acts of volition merely arise spontaneously. On page 12, what will my next mental state be? I do not know. It just happens. And then on page 14, but where intentions themselves come from remains perfectly mysterious in subjective terms. But then he switches later to his rational agent view, page 28. And we know that the brain systems that allow us to reflect upon our experience are different from those involved when we automatically react to stimuli. So early on, all we were machines reacting to external, internal stimuli. But now we have the ability to reflect on our experience. And that reflection then brings about new goals, new beliefs, new desires. And then on page 24, he admits actions, intentions, beliefs, and desires can exist only in a system that is significantly constrained by patterns of behavior and the laws of stimulus response. The possibility of reasoning with other human beings, or indeed finding their behaviors and utterances comprehensible at all, depends on the assumption that their thoughts and actions will obediently ride the rails of a shared reality. So now we can respond to stimuli, like the stimulus of the pain leads to that loop about judging whether the pain is bad enough, comparing that to our goal of wanting to avoid pain, and then next leading to the mental desire to book an appointment with the therapist. So out of these two conflicting views of the mind, coming from two conflicting motives of Sam, one disproving free will and the other one, and yet proving we are still morally responsible for our actions, that it's caused a real mess in argument in his book. And it generates these three paradoxes, which I think is debilitating to his whole argument. The first one, the paradox of mental causation. Second, the paradox of reasons. And the third I call the paradox of freedom. And I want to show what each of those are. So the first, Harris's paradox of mental causation. So my point here is if our intentions are now causal states of the brain, as in Harris's version 2 rational agent view, when our intentions are now causal states of our brain, then why can't some of those intentions be caused by previous brain states that are identical to previous mental states? And remember this diagram I put up before of his rational agent view, and I just look to the middle and the right of the diagram. So its intentions are identical to a neural brain process, and both of those together then cause the action of holding up the little old lady. But far from these intentions just somehow appearing from nowhere, who knows from where? Well, we know from unconscious brain processes, Sam told us. But if intentions are now just causal states of the brain, then why can't our intentions be caused by previous brain states, which are themselves previous mental states? It could be a desire, a belief, or a value, and that causes a later intention. So intentions then no longer are things that just mysteriously pop into our minds from the universe. They can be causally generated from our own minds. So these are the 3 points that I make there on the left. Oh, and before those 3 points, that's the point of that extra piece of the diagram there on the left, where a neuronal state is now identical with a belief or a desire or a value, and that together then causes some later intention or belief or desire. Okay, so the 3 points I've got here is that mental events like decisions, intentions, efforts, goals, then are no longer causally inert, as per Harris version 1, the helpless puppet view. And this explains why our choices, as felt subjectively, do not appear to arise spontaneously in a perfectly mysterious way, as Harris had posited in his earlier version 1 view. So we can see that not just that he's wrong, we can see why he is wrong. And then the last point, that Harris's disproof of free will, based on the supposed fact that we are not the conscious source of our thoughts and actions, therefore fails. Now, this is another big paradox, Harris's paradox of reasons. So looking at his, on the left there, Harris's version 1 helpless puppet view. On page 29, he says, because a person's choices merely appear in his mind as though sprung from the void, you might be able to tell a story about how your life unraveled, but you cannot truly account for why you let it happen. And then on page 31, he says, again, you might have a story to tell about why things were different this time around, but it would be nothing more than a post hoc description of events that you did not control. And then lastly on 35, he says, of course, I could tell a story about why I'm doing what I'm doing, but the actual explanation for my behavior is hidden from me. So the picture here in the hidden helpless puppet view is that we do things, but we really have no idea why we do things. We make up these stories, but literally they're just post hoc rationalizations. We don't really know. And then moving over to the right-hand column, he changes that way of looking at reasoning with his version 2 rational agent view. He says on page 24, the possibility of reasoning with other human beings, or indeed of finding their behaviours and utterances comprehensible at all, depends on the assumption that their thoughts and actions will obediently ride the rails of a shared reality. Then on page 37, getting behind our conscious thoughts and feelings can allow us to steer a more intelligent course through our lives, while knowing, of course, that we are ultimately being steered. And now on page 40, because what we do subsequent to conscious planning tends to most fully reflect the global properties of our minds, our beliefs, desires, goals, prejudices, etc. So my key point here is that on Harris's own account, if his decision to reject the notion of free will is simply a story he tells himself and others that is nothing but a post hoc rationalization that sprung from the void, then why ought we pay his arguments against free will any attention? Why ought we pay attention to any of his reasons he gives for holding any of his beliefs and for making any of his decisions? So that's the paradox of reasons. And then the final paradox is the paradox of freedom. So on the left there, what he says when he's in his version 1 helpless puppet mode of thinking, he says, my mental life is simply given to me by the cosmos. And on page 9, thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. And then lastly on page 12, what will my next mental state be? I do not know. It just happens. And then contrast that with his rational agent view over there on the right that he trots out later. He says on page 37, becoming sensitive to the background causes of one's thoughts and feelings can, paradoxically, allow for greater creative control over one's life. And I like this sentence. It's probably my favorite sentence in the whole book. This understanding reveals you to be a biochemical puppet, of course, but it also allows you to grab a hold of one of your strings. So this is really revealing because remember, on the front cover of Sam Harris's book, he's got the words free will and he's got those letters dancing to puppet strings. So I'm hoping now if he ever revises this book, he's going to have one of those puppet strings being pulled by the supposed person with free will, like this young lady here who's got some agency. She now has some control in how she lives her life because she can pull on one of those strings that then determine for herself how she's going to act. So she can grab hold of one of your strings. So this is really instructive. This is really instructive of this shift from the helpless puppet view once again to the rational agent view. This is the paradox of freedom. Now, Sam Harris calls it a paradox. He says paradoxically, but the point I make in my essay is you can call it a paradox, but let's really call it for what it is. For all of these three paradoxes, they're not paradoxes. They are outright contradictions in Harris's argument. They're contradictions, and I try and explain as best I can how these contradictions come about because he's got two very different motives with his book. One is we have no free will because we are just helpless puppets dancing to the strings of the cosmos. And two, the other big motivation, we're still morally responsible for our actions because we have some conscious control. And here he uses the word creative control. Another place he talks about we have freedom in determining how we view the past events in our lives. We have freedom. So he wants to show that we really are still responsible for our actions because we have control over our lives. Okay, so in conclusion, these three paradoxes, as I say, they're not really paradoxes. That's a very overly charitable way of putting it. They're really just explicit contradictions. The paradox of mental causation, paradox of reasons, paradox of freedom. So Harris's argument against the assumption that he thought was false, that assumption that we are not the conscious source of our thoughts and actions, I think that argument fails. And then secondly, with Harris's lack of response to the persuasive conditional sense of could have, his argument against that second assumption that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past, that argument then also fails. So with both those arguments against free will failing, I'm putting the case, well, this is putting the case that Harris's argument overall against free will fails. Now, I'm not saying that we do have free will. That actually is my view. But I'm not arguing here that we do have free will. I'm just arguing that Harris's argument against it fails. Some of you might be thinking, well, Les, what is your view on free will? But I try and give a reasonably comprehensive case for free will being compatible with determinism. And I think, so it boils down to what I call my 4C theory. I think there are 4 requirements for an agent to act freely in a particular case, and that is they didn't feel compelled to, that they weren't controlled by a third party, like a brain implant put in there by a mad scientist. The third is that that the act was consonant with their character and their highest order desires. And the fourth is that that the agent had cognitive capability to deliberate and offer reasons for action. And I sum all my 4C theory in this, I think, 2 sentences. Freedom of the will is a characteristic of an autonomous conscious agent who can reason and deliberate about alternative courses of action. Such a person is constituted by their character, and that within the bounds of this character, the agent faces a range of options on how to act in a given situation. When this range is encumbered or restricted by either subverting the person's character or compromising their capacity for rational deliberation and action, the person's freedom is diminished when it's encumbered or restricted. So that case I give in my free will and compatibilism paper, and I have 9 arguments for it. And anyone who's interested, I do invite you to go and have a look. Oh, references. So they're the references that I use for this particular talk. I have a longer list of references in my longer paper. To access other videos and podcasts in this series, go to the Philosophy Resources section of the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com.